Well, I appreciate that because it has happened to me before. So we are recording now. And as I mentioned in the introductory video, usually I'm going to try to avoid doing a lot of lecturing in this course. As you can see, I provided a lot of readings. Um, because I think this is something you have to consume in your own time, in your own way. I encourage you to take notes, write in the margins, mark up your texts. I realize they're all digital texts, so if you have noticed in the TAMUC library, you can download various different pages so that you can have them at your access. And if you have any trouble accessing anything, if it's not in the PDF, just let me know because I will do everything I can to make this as accessible to you as possible. Um, so welcome everyone. Thank you for being here. What I'd like to do is first talk just a little bit about the texts. I tend to find more materials than people can consume. So you may have to say to me, stop, I can't read that fast, or that's too much, or slow down, which is, and I'm perfectly okay with that. Um, when I get passionate about something, I dig deep. And I have been doing that for a few years in the work that I've been in this subject. So the first thing that I wanted to introduce you to is, where did the book go? I have misplaced. It's not where it's supposed to be, or it's underneath the pile. Was the Cillier's book. I had it a minute ago. Where did it go? That is, oh, it's right here in front of me. This book. That is one of the books that I have asked you to read that is available in the library. You're not going to read the whole book. And in fact, as I reviewed it again, I thought, for first timers, this may be a little bit heavy. So you guide me on how it's working, which is one of the reasons I also asked you to diagram some of the work that you're doing, what you're reading, because there's a lot of new vocabulary that's going to come to play in understanding how systems work and how complexity works. I want you to make it sense out of it in a way that works for you and makes sense. Consequently, diagramming and annotating is the best way that I know how, and I'll try to make that clearer as we move along. So I have to go back to, I'm going to stop. Excuse me. I need to move back a screen here. And I lost, yeah, here we go. We should be, I don't think you're not seeing my screen anymore, are you? Let me reshare because I had to get out and move tabs.
We are.
Oh, you are? Excellent.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for that. All right, so you've already read these introductory. I'm going to assume that if I put it out there, you read it. So if you haven't and you need any assistance with clarifications, by all means, reach out. And I know that as I receive questions, I try to answer them for the whole group. These are the 4 modules that we're going to be doing. I have readings in all of these, but I'm trying to make sure that that I haven't overwhelmed you. So that's why I have hidden those readings already. So as you can see, I started by trying to just give you some materials that would make it user-friendly. Because complexity theory is enormous. And it really depends on who you're listening to. It comes from so many different disciplines, physics, engineering, to name just a few, and things that I can't even pretend to understand. There's mathematical models, and there's all different ways of looking at it. My son is in risk management, and he did his master's thesis and is wanting to move into complexity theory in terms of risk management and global warming. And he has a whole nother set of people that I've never even heard of. So it's not that any of these people are right or wrong, but you're going to find that there is a very large body of knowledge, and that some people don't even come to the same definitions of what complexity is. My task is to help you see things differently, perhaps open your mind to other tools that can help you reframe your research question from a complexity perspective in a way that makes it your task of writing your dissertation, or perhaps even solving the problems that you came to this program with in a more generative way. So I'm hoping to give you some tools that will simplify what I have just described as being very complicated or complex. And we're actually going to look at something to see, well, what's the difference between something that is complicated and something that is complex? Because you will see that in the literature quite a bit. So I cited just a second ago this book, the Cilliers book, which is available in the library. I think that I asked you just to read the first 3 chapters because it just gives you a good basis of what complexity means. And he's one of the main people that is cited over and over and over again. So I think it's a seminal text that will serve our purposes. Another text that is really important for those of us that are in education is this book that is expensive, and I think you can check it out of the library, but I didn't ask you to buy it because for an introductory course that is really, really quick, because it's only 4 weeks, I didn't want to ask you to spend that kind of money. So I'm trying to find chapters and pieces of it. It's in the recommended, it's in alternate sources on the syllabus, but Davis and Sumara write extensively about things related to education in the context of complexity. So I found that chapter that I thought you would find interesting and a little bit easier actually to read than the Cilliers chapter. The reason that this is the first time I've ever done that, is if you don't like those chapters or they don't make sense to you, keep reading, and here's some other chapters of some things that I thought might make a little bit more sense, just to get your head wrapped around what it means, what a complex system means, and what it looks like. So your task is to read these chapters or something that makes sense to you, and to diagram it in a way that makes, as you see and understand complexity at this point in time in your journey, if that makes any sense. And that's what I want you to post on the Padlet. You can certainly add your comments and your thoughts, but I want you to understand that the Padlet it's a tool for discussion. I use Padlet over the D2L tool because it's so easy to access from any device anywhere. And if you subscribe, you will get other people's comments in your own email, and you can just respond right there, so you don't have to open up one more thing. I found it to be very user-friendly, and many students have liked it. So that's the purpose for the Padlet, and it's going to be one place so that you always go to with different discussions that will open up over the course of this semester. So that's what I'm talking about with this particular set of readings for this particular week. One of the assignments, I did not write a long, drawn-out explanation of what a reflective learning log looks like, because I'm open to your learning journey. I have used logs where you have like a T-chart. This is what it says, here's quotes, and here's my thinking. If that suits your needs, that's great. I've also done it where you have to write, you can just take notes. Your learning log is your tool for you to record your thoughts and to show that you are reading, and help you to synthesize and make sense of the readings. Then what I would like you to do is write some sort of a reflective statement that summarizes kind of what you have gained from the knowledge, not necessarily repeating what you read, but rather showing your reflection and interaction and what you are taking away from what you have read. It doesn't have to be a perfect statement. You have plenty to do. This is not your dissertation. It's just showing a progress of learning as you're adding to the pieces. So in this case, part of your learning log could be that representation that you created. I will show you some representations at the end of things that I did in reference to my dissertation. You're not at that point right now, so I'm not asking you to do that. But I just want to try to give you as many examples of things as I can. So that's pretty much it. I believe everybody that's in this room already introduced themselves and wrote their inquiry question so far. Your learning log is due each Sunday, and it's a culmination of what you've been learning for the week. And then your engagement and Padlet discussions are being able to, I will focus on specific articles when I give you a lot of material so that you can narrow the focus, and maybe the discussion that you have on Padlet will help each other think, because that's what the social aspects of learning is all about. Do you have any questions up to this point? Or have I made things muddier? Hopefully not.
I'm not sure I fully understand the personal or professional inquiry assignment that's due tomorrow. Is that because I think you had mentioned in one of the, I don't know if it was the syllabus or a post, but somewhere it said something to the effect of like, this is going to be more formal, a more formal version of the Padlet. I mean, is that,
Okay.
I'm just wondering what specifically you're looking for in that.
The Padlet was meant to just introduce to others. This is where I'm at in here's my inquiry. It was just a synthesis to others. The statement that I'm asking you to submit is something that's a little bit more thought out. So it might be approximately 500 words, I think I said. So that's about 2 pages of double space typing that provides a little bit more background and context to your research question and what you're heading towards. Some of you did a really thorough job in the Padlet post. You can use a lot of that. I just thought that by submitting it in a more formal sense on the D2L, it gives you a chance to be clearer. Does that make sense? Okay, is that reasonable? I always like to ask that question because sometimes people go, I can't do that. That doesn't make any that I hear your words, but I really don't get it. So you need to tell me when that is the case.
I think it sounds reasonable to me. I think my confusion or hang up was over, the fact of like, okay, is this a continuation of our question from last semester? And if so, are we trying to we're not trying to restyle our understanding into something that is already adaptive to complexity theory, right? We're just kind of explaining where we are based on what we've already done. And then we'll go, as we read more and get further into the class, then we'll be kind of rethinking it.
Yes.
Okay.
That's the way that I'm looking at. That's why I'm calling this a seminar, because there's not a perfect answer or resolution to anything that you're going to do, which is nobody likes that answer because it's very gray and muddy. But that's what this whole journey is. You have to take it piece by piece, and you have to understand the framework of what something that is complex looks like. And so the first module is just to understand the concept of complexity. Now, the next module is going to take one aspect of that, and I hope that one of the readings or the video that I showed explain that there's different types of complexity, and one of them is complex adaptive systems. And that's the one that we're going to be focusing on specifically, using specific tools that I'm hopefully going to bring to you that I was exposed to, because I think they make the most sense for our work together and what you, as I understand it, will need to accomplish in your doctoral program. So, and that's why we call it adaptive action, because systems, one of the biggest things that I have learned is, I'm not trying to be cheesy here, but systems learn. A system learns from itself because they start from the bottom up, as opposed to something that is simple, that starts from a hierarchical system that starts from the top down. We live in this is a conundrum for me, because we all work in places, in systems that are very much hierarchical. They are part of a hierarchy that is very linear, and yet we are faced with problems that are not linear, and that's why they're called complex. So one of the things that I'm going to do today, just to stick to my agenda for a second, is we're going to use this tool called the power of questioning to help us re-examine the questions that you've already put on the table. You're welcome to change your question anytime because your questions are your own. And I expect that over the course of even your entire doctoral program, maybe in this court, I'm not sure, your questions will evolve. I have met many doctoral students that wrote a dissertation and they got to their committee and their committee said, if something's not working, and their advisor said, then change your question. And I thought, you can change your question after you've done all that work? And they said, yes, of course you can. And it made perfect sense because your mind was working around that question. You were just using the wrong words. So hopefully some of this will help you to see how of course, words matter, but there's so many different ways to frame what you're going to see is called a wicked issue. They tend to be intractable or feel like they're intractable, which means that there's not solvable. And because they keep coming back over and over and over again. But before I do that, I am presenting, I'm not going to show you 4 videos right now because that would not be a good use of your time. But as I said, I always bring in more resources than you can use. So you may pick and choose. I will post this in D2L when we're done. But I do want to show you this one right here, because that one really caught my attention. I think that cognitively you can go, okay, I know the difference between complex and complicated. Anyone want to venture a guess as to what they think the difference is between something that is complicated? Yeah, Sherry?
Okay, so I might be getting this very wrong, but if I read it correctly, something that's complicated is like it'll have a lot of pieces in it, a lot of components, but you can break those down and separate them. And then when you put them back together, they're the same. Whereas something complex, it's like the ingredients that go into it create something unique. And in my head, I was thinking like, okay, there's the example of like, let's say you have a radio. A radio is complicated. You can take it apart into all the little pieces and then you can put it back together again and it's still a radio and it's very like these are the pieces. Whereas if you're baking a cake, I'm adding eggs and flour and everything else. And when I bring it out of the oven, it's something new and unique that I can't just pull out the eggs after I've baked the cake. Like it's something that's formed out of other stuff. I don't know if that's right or not.
Well, let's see how your thoughts match up to what this says. Anybody else want to add to that or find any examples either from their reading or their own lives? Okie dokie. This one's really simple and it's, one of those generated things. So I'll let you watch it on your own, but I liked this one. So let's see if I can make this, if I make this bigger. There we go. Can you still see it? Okay.
Hello, everybody again. Today I want to talk about self-organizing teams and specifically the word complicated versus complex. Now, I want to talk about a common language. Quite often when we talk about complex or complicated, we often interchange the words. We often say, hey, well, that's a complex thing to manage, or that's pretty complicated. But actually, if we sit and think about the meanings of those 2 words, complicated versus complex, and specifically from an engineering and organizational perspective, they really are 2 different things that require 2 different methods to manage them. Okay, so now I would like to talk about the word complicated, and specifically in engineering and business terms. Now, when we talk about complicated, we often mean really too much information for us to process in one time. Now, the old thing, you can only remember 7 things at once, the short-term memory. In a way, it's an extension of that from the human brain. It's just too much information for us. So how do we manage complicated things? Well, we do reductionists. We break them down into smaller parts. And those...
So I like that. Take note of that word reductionist. You're going to see that in the literature a lot. And I think that this speaks to some of what Sherry just mentioned with lots and lots of parts. And think about how you have ever solved something that you thought was very, very challenging, or even how in schools we ask teachers to break things down in order to either teach it or resolve a problem. So a lot of our education systems have been very reductionist in nature, I would venture to say.
Smaller parts, by putting them into smaller parts, we're able to understand the whole. An easy example is, say, a combustion engine. And combustion engine is complicated. There are many parts to it. But we can start to understand the combustion engine by simply looking at the different parts of the engine, from the crankshaft to the injectors to the spark and so on. The other thing about complicated systems is they are linear in nature. Their input and outputs can be predicted. With an input to the system, we're able to predict the output of the system. And that's another important attribute when we talk about complicated systems.
Just to add to that, another term that you will also see in the literature is this concept of simple systems. So we teach simple systems in schools, you know, in early science classes. I remember that anyway. And so when you saw those linear systems with the line in the ball bearing at the bottom, that's a simple system. When you keep adding a lot of parts, it becomes a more complicated system. So simple systems are linear. There's a right or a wrong. It's
now
either
I'd like
or.
to talk about complex systems. And I want to introduce a term, complex adaptive systems. Now, complex adaptive systems is whereby the sum of the parts are far greater than the parts themselves. Now, if we take complicated systems, really the complexity of a complicated system is simply the number of parts you have. But complex adaptive systems, the parts themselves may be simple, but when you put them together, you get a very complex system. Now, what exactly does that mean? Or what examples can we use for complex adaptive systems? Well, the first thing is they are non-linear in nature, and it's not possible to predict them. The other attribute of complex adaptive systems from an organizational perspective is there is no leader. There is a certain set of guidelines that each component, or not guidelines, but if you like, rules that each component does, but there is no leader. They come from the bottom up. And that's a very important part of complex systems. So it'll become much clearer when we just think of some simple examples. So imagine a flock of birds. Now, if you've seen them sometimes in the autumn time, or you may have often seen birds migrating, it's really amazing to see all those birds seemingly together. Now, you don't have a standard organizational structure. You don't have bird CEO or foreman CEOs managing all the birds flying around. Each bird has a set of rules, if you like, you know, collision rules, proximity rules, staying in a certain position. And based on those rules, combined together, you create this incredible system that seems to be all working in symphony, yet there is no leader. Now, this is very important when we talk about self-organizing teams. Because when we talk about self-organizing teams, quite often we're aiming to try and create that system. Because the other attribute of this system is this system adapts to the environment. It adapts to change. These interconnections work together to move to a different environment or move towards or away from whatever might be a threat.
Sorry to interrupt, but I don't know if you caught the language that was on the screen, and it said simple rules at the beginning. That is another term that you're going to see quite often in the literature. We'll be talking more about that next week. In order for these flocks of birds to do what they do without crashing into each other and go in the right direction and make these beautiful patterns, they create simple rules amongst themselves. Think about it. Families, churches, organizations, the way that we behave, cultures, there are simple rules that we follow that dictate our pattern. Now, who wrote those rules? We don't know. I mean, they evolved through time, through history. So think about that's a concept that you will see often in the literature.
Threatening them in terms of meeting their goal from the environment. But there is no leader. And I think that's one of the most important aspects of a self-organizing team is that you have this ability to adapt and change, and you allow the team to create their own interconnection. So now I want to leave this final part and talk about the kind of problems that we tend to face in industry versus complicated versus complex. Now, if you have a complex system, a problem that is complex, the way you need to manage it is by allowing your team to work more and shape themselves more to the environment they're in. And what you don't want to do in such a complex system is create more a hierarchical structure. And what tends to happen, they call it the vicious circle of complexity in teams, is quite often a company is in trouble, they're facing a difficult problem, so they add more people. And they see that this isn't working, and they're adding more people. But actually what they're doing is they're adding to their complexity. They're trying to use the reductionist approach by having, command and control centers, more and more people. But what's actually doing is creating the system more complex. And you need a complex adaptive mindset in order to manage it rather than a reductionist command and control, little armies that you might see from Napoleon times. You need a very different approach to manage it. And that's kind of quite often the mistakes and challenges of a self-organizing team, is that we often been used to in industry in using these very much reductionist standard organizational structures. Whereas when we're managing highly complex systems, as in the case now of modern software, we need to use the shape like the birds. Look at how the birds manage migration. There is no boss, there is no leader yet. Through the system of complex adaptation, they're able to migrate thousands of miles to other places. And this is the type of approach that we should use when we're thinking of complex adaptive teams. So thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and also subscribe. It really helps. So until next time, bye-bye.
I'd like you to, what are your thoughts? There are certain things that come to mind, but I don't want to say them, that I'm going red flag, or that makes sense. I'd love to hear your impressions of, or your thoughts about what he has said about the complex systems and specifically complex adaptive systems. Anyone? Do we have any principals in the room? Or former principals?
Yes.
Okay. When you hear of this concept of self-organization, and what comes to mind? Do you?
So
anything?
I resonated with what he said about in an organization when there's a complex situation or problem, what we tend to do is add people instead of letting them evolve. What just is very prominent, and I don't know if anybody else knows, but standardized scores are in. And right now, the big buzz in most of the districts right now are the STAR scores. And so for me, I'm thinking, how can I allow my teachers to create their own vertical team for the new science standards that are coming out? And how do I allow them to make it their own by giving them that autonomy and not being so, this is how I want it, so micromanaging, but letting them solve it on their own and kind of allowing them that evolution, that evolving of, this is what we're going to come up with. This is what, within some guidelines. So it's complex to think about it because, you need some guidelines, you need some rules, but at the same time, as an instructional leader, you have to allow your teachers that autonomy to own it and, take charge, so that by doing so, they're going to be invested in what they created themselves.
Thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts?
Yeah, I think, he talked about, when you add people, things can become more challenging. But then, like, C&I faculty is a good example, right? There's like, what, 75 of y'all or something? So let's say we have a big, state level change. We've got 3 months to enact something. Do we put 6 people in a room, 8 people in a room? all 75 of y'all in a room? Who gets to be in the room? Like it gets very, very complex very quickly, because it's like at some point, if there's 70 of us in there just chatting, we're not going to get anything done, because I don't think we have the simple rules like the birds. Like, we're not necessarily all following the same simple rules with the same timeline in mind, or the same, I don't know. It's like at a certain point, if you get too many people in a room, you're not going to get where you're going. I don't know.
I hear you. I think one of the red flags that came up to me was this concept of, it sounds like very free flowy, just let it flow and it'll all work itself out. And that's why I asked if, because I'm thinking that's got to be a leader's nightmare, because it doesn't work that way. It's too complex. Why doesn't it work that way? Because we have histories, we have personalities, we have context. It's not just one answer fits every solution. And I think that's part of what you will see if you were to dig deeper into some of these videos. They do illustrate how things are not simple, or it's not just a lot of moving parts. And if you put them if it's not a puzzle, if you put everything in the right place, it'll magically resolve itself. And what's interesting that I didn't even think about until just now is that when I did my dissertation, one of the findings was that you had to have structure in place in order for the system to work. Required a set of rules, it required a set of structure. So there had to be some sort of agreements, and those weren't necessarily rules the kids asked for. It was the rules that the teacher put in place. So as leaders, as human beings, we crave that set of direction as well. And that's another implication from that. I don't want to belabor that. I just wanted it to be a little bit of fuel for thought to kind of frame this concept of where we're going to with complex adaptive systems. So one of the questions that I want you to be thinking about as we move forward and throughout this course is, what ecosystem does your problem live in? So when you think about an ecosystem, an ecosystem is alive. It has lots of moving pieces that interact. And as you continue to read the literature, you'll get some of the vocabulary that relates to this concept of an ecosystem. So that's just an overarching essential question to think about. I want to move now to something called wicked issues. Let me see if I could make that bigger. It might be easier to read that. A wicked issue is another way of framing the concept of a challenge. Your burning questions, you might have been asked many times, what's your burning question? To the point of like, oh, don't ask me anymore. Or what you'll see a lot in the literature too is this concept of an intractable issue. So this is a quote I lifted from one of my HSD, I'm trying to remember which book, perhaps this book, that I should have probably asked you to buy, but if you really get into this stuff, then I'll give you a list and you can spend money. But it's called Radical Rules for Schools. I was trying to keep you from spending money because you might go, okay, she just gave me a headache. So if we need to keep talking, we'll talk. But this was written by these people from the Human Systems HSD, Human Systems Dynamic, what is it? I've just lost the term. Human Systems Dynamics Institute. And one of the ladies, Leslie Patterson, was one of my professors that introduced me to all of this. Well, she and her sisters, it's actually her sister's dissertation that led to all of this set of tools that we're going to be using for adaptive action. And they define this concept of a wicked problem as one that has no solution. You can define it in multiple ways, and each way suggests a different solution. Many different stakeholders cause the problem. Have you ever thought about that? Have you ever, I think of sometimes, if we just didn't have parents, we wouldn't have any problems in schools. Or if the administrators would just stay out of it, we would be just fine. And that's not an insult to any administrators that are in the room. I'm just thinking this is the talk that sometimes if the boss would just go home, it would be great. Sometimes So many different stakeholders cause the problem, and many stakeholders, sometimes the same ones, are required to solve it. What appears to be a solution may merely mask the problem for a while or generate even worse unintended consequences. Wicked problems plague the global community today. For example, climate change, violent conflict, hunger, corruption, just a few of them. Our clients' issues, meaning the clients of human FHSD, may not be that far reaching, but they are equally wicked. Our problems, we're not trying to solve global climate change, but testing and getting good test scores is very real to us, but it's a problem that hasn't gone away yet, and it just seems to get bigger. So I think that's a pretty wicked issue. Employee engagement, quality, sustainability, agility, teamwork, innovation. These are buzzwords that I think many of us who are in schools would recognize as being problems that we're having to deal with. So let's talk about some of the things. And here's the source where it comes from. When you get this, I'll be able to show you where there's a lot of resources related to the work we're going to be doing. So let's move on. So we're going to do a process. It's a protocol called the power of questions, and it's really very common sense, but I'm going to ask you, I'm going to see how much time we have. Okay, what I'm going to ask you to do is to try to engage in this based on some of the problems that you've already framed. And it really comes from this concept of being able to stand in inquiry in order to move to find a generative solution to any of our issues. So the process is simple and elegant. And what you're seeing right there, you see those words, what, so what, and now what? That is the adaptive action cycle. I used to use it in my classroom with my 7th graders. I've used it with my college students. I'm going to use it with you because I use it when I write papers. It's just this cycle of inquiry that takes me through a process of framing what I want to say and what I want to resolve. So you have already described your wicked issue briefly. I'll show you some of the things that you've had. It's on your on the Padlet. So the next thing that I want you to think about is you're going to ask each other some questions about that particular problem. By questioning, you're not trying to solve, nor are you, and these are going to be open-ended questions. They're authentic to the problem, but they're not disguised in terms of advice. Like, well, if you were to give fewer tests, don't you think everyone would be happier? Well, that's a question, but there's an implication of judgment there, and it's advice giving, and that's not useful in this case. I'll give you an example of a couple things in a second. The person who is receiving the questions, they don't reply. They just take it. They just listen. They jot them down. I'm going to ask you to actually jot down some of your thoughts in the Padlet so you have a record of it for yourselves. And then what you end up doing at the end of that is that you think about, okay, what all this input I just received, what patterns do I see? Or what are my next, what they call in literature, what's my next wise action? What am I going to do now as a result of these questions that I have been asked? So it's a rhetorical exercise, but when I have done this with other students, they usually going, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way. So here's an opportunity for us to think about our own question, perhaps in a different way. Before we move to that, let me give you an example of some things. We usually tend to ask how and why questions as opposed to what questions, but every now and then, it just depends on how you say it. So if the challenge is, it feels like we spend more time testing than teaching in schools, if that's a problem from a teacher's perspective, for example, maybe an administrator, I don't know. What are the consequences of accountability age put in place years ago? How can you simplify testing? Who are the powers involved? I always look at the power structure when I'm thinking of an issue. Who stands to benefit from testing? Is testing appropriate for everyone? That's not a how or a why. We could rephrase that. But I see it as a bigger question. How did we get here to this point of high stakes testing? How do we know if standardized testing is increasing rigor? So those are just some examples of questions related to a common question that I hear from teachers and that I see as an observer in classrooms quite often. So that's where we're going to end up. So let me back up for a second. I want to go to another screen. Here's the Padlet that you've been posting on. And one of the cool things of this, the way that, because each of you framed it, added a plus sign, I can actually show. And we can try to get our heads wrapped around it. If you have your Padlet open, I would recommend that you do open your Padlet. Otherwise, you can write questions and thoughts in the chat box of this discussion and I can transfer it. But here were the instructions, and let me move to one of Sophia wrote her question here. I want to give you a few minutes to just open your Padlet so that you can read the questions more easily than me flipping through a screen at a pace that might not work for you. I just open mine either on another device or in another tab. I'm also going to ask if there is anyone in the room that would like to volunteer to be the open subject to allow us to practice with you. Looks like we're missing 3 people. I don't see. I think she told us her nick, how she wants to be called. Ada, I think is what she said.
It's Ade.
Ade, are you here? You are here. I'm so sorry. You're right.
I am.
How can I miss you? I apologize. Thank you. It looked like you had a child. I remember yours had to do with differentiating.
Yes.
Specific to math concerns. Differentiation, I think, is something every teacher struggles with, even our most experienced teachers.
So you can use mine as an example.
Would you like to do that? Okay.
Yes.
Would you care to summarize this so that we can hear it? Tell us a little bit about your situation and what you're trying to go after.
Yes, so I happen to teach in a school where we have underserved kids, and in the same class we have the very high kids, we have the very low kids, we have sped kids, everyone in the same classroom, which I think is not supposed to be so. So now the problem is, how do we differentiate instructions for those kids? Because at the end of the day, after the testing and everything, the very high kids are still very much high. And I feel like they're not even challenged enough. And the low ones, they still remain low, and they're not trying to meet up, coupled with the fact that the curriculum we use now is quite fast-paced. So the challenge is, how do we actually differentiate instructions for all of those kids in the same classroom to make sure the low ones show growth and the high ones keep attaining that mastery and end up not dropping and even go beyond that. So that was my reason for all of that.
Thank you.
And another thing is, because this is one of the reasons why the achievement gap, we're just unable to close. It keeps getting wide and wide and wide. And I like how we did something about the standardized testing, because it's not a good measure of actually saying if kids are actually where they're supposed to be. So that's just a summary of everything.
Okay. Would anyone, what I'm looking for, you can see, I think I changed screens. I was trying to find your specific one. Here's Justin, because what I thought,
Oh, that's mine.
there you are. if you can find her particular, it's the one right under the yellow, so it'll be easy to find. I tend to put my instructions in yellow to make it easy to find. But in the comment section, this would be a great place. I want you to verbalize your questions, but in order for her to be able to capture them, I did keep notes, but we'll post our thoughts as well. In this way, we have a collective record of this particular discussion. I'm going to start because the first thing that my question was, and I'm going to let each person, we don't have to explain our questions, we just have to ask them. And Ade, did I say that correctly?
Yes.
If you will just listen and then synthesize when you're done, when we're finished.
Okay.
Which just take a few minutes. So my first question is this really, or how shall I, that's an is question. This is hard to do. How do we know that this is a question of differentiation? This isn't an easy exercise, so feel free to take your time and think of other things related to her issue that you'd like to ask. Another question that comes to my mind is, has to do with the systems that the teacher has in place. What systems does the teacher have in place to manage so many different I'm going to say learning capacities?
I mean, this kind of assumes that there was one, but like, what was the rationale of creating the class makeup that way in the roster in the first place?
Okay. I'm not sure if you have it open, you can post the question or I can do it. Either way, it's fine. Whatever works for you.
Make sure I'm on the right place. Mine doesn't, Dr. Slay, how do you get yours to go up like that? Because mine is showing the comments as like a tiny little piece at the bottom and it's not letting me easily scroll.
Oh, do you see this little bar?
I do. It's just that my area is much smaller out of the
Okay.
square.
Excuse me, I'm going to let my dog in before she tears the door down. Okay. Are you on a computer or a smaller device?
I'm on a computer, but I don't want to take up Addie's time, so I'll deal with it later.
Okay. Well, we can certainly scribe for you. Do you want make it easier? What was your thought? Say it again.
I have it.
Okay. I had another question.
There's more questions posted, but they're not showing up on your screen.
For that particular item?
Yes.
let me try to refresh. Let's see what's going on. Maybe that's why. Maybe this was not a good plan. Sorry.
So I
Oh,
think you
look
had
at that.
both
There you go.
completed.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Well, go ahead. Yesenia, do you want to
Yes.
state the question?
I put, how are teachers prepared, like basically professional development to teach math to such a diverse population?
Okay.
Fine, I had two. Does teacher experience impact effectiveness of differentiating strategies? And how does the instructional team on the campus support teachers with differentiating?
Okay. Other questions, anyone? So this is an example of the protocol. You can see that it takes a lot to think of things from different perspectives. We've got different stakeholders that are being brought into this conversation. Something else that I was thinking about had to do with the teacher's own experience. How does the teacher learn, or I'm just thinking about how they're able to observe, whether or not they're able to see other examples of differentiation in practice. Now I have to phrase that in a question that's useful. How often do teachers get to observe or learn from other examples of math, science teachers with diverse populations? Anything else for this one? We can do, I think we still have time to do one more. We're going to get close to the end, but I'd like to do one more if someone is willing. But before that, Abede, your thoughts? What do you think about these questions, and what direction are you going to stay with this question, or do you want to refine your question? What patterns do you see?
I think I might have to refine it, but still on differentiation instruction.
Okay, so in that inquiry statement that I asked you to type, this is a good opportunity for you to be able to work through this questioning and maybe rethink it, because as I said, our questions should change as we move, because my advisors told me 1,000 times, Laura, frame your window. And I was told to narrow, 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 to the point that it was almost ad nauseum, because I kept seeing these big pictures. But in order for me to be able to resolve something, it wasn't this concept of reduction. It was more of a concept of frame that concern with a lot of different parameters so that I can see it more clearly. And that's what I ultimately found by the time I finished my study. Thank you for allowing us to work with your question. Anyone else wish to put themselves out up in front? The other option, if you're not ready to do that, is what I would like to ask you to do is read through each other's questions and take the time to post a question or two that you think will help each other, because it takes time. I know this is not easy, so it may be too much to consume right now, because we have to really think this through. But post some questions for each other, read their challenges, help them reframe it or to see it from a perspective they might not have thought of before, because your experience is different, or your question might be alike, or you just see things differently. So that's an added task, but this is part of the discussion that I can ask you to do as you move forward. We have just a couple more minutes in our time together. And let me see if I can go back to oh, here's my presentation. So I wanted to show you an example. So the closing questions I had are, what other questions might frame your challenge? That's where you're leading yourselves as you start to think about your questions in different ways. What are the patterns that you see in your challenge? Rhetorical questions, but something to consider when you're writing your statement. These last two slides are some pages that I included in my dissertation when I talk about drawing things. This was one of my initial analysis page. This is nothing that I'm asking you to replicate. I'm just taking you a little bit on my journey. That's all. When I wrote my dissertation, it all started from this concept of expository writing. Once upon a time, we tested expository writing. That term doesn't even exist except in reading anymore. And that was the big conundrum. I really struggled with this. I taught 7th grade for many years, after having taught elementary school and gifted and talented. And when I went to the 7th grade to teach expository writing, and I attended institutes, I did a lot of professional development with it. And the one problem that remained static was nobody knew what it meant. Nobody could define expository writing. That was a huge problem. And I thought, well, how can you teach something that nobody can agree on what it is? So that was the beginning of my deep dive into expository writing. And so my dissertation talks about definitions and where it came, and I traced it way back to the beginning of time and all of that, which I won't bother you with. But then what I did was I observed I did a case study of two different teachers, two case studies, two 7th grade teachers, and I observed them teaching an expository writing unit. And I did everything on my iPad. I recorded them and I wrote my notes, all these things that you may learn at various stages of your research, whenever you take your research courses. And then I had to analyze it, and I had to do what we call coding. So we had to and coding is really finding patterns in the data. So I had lots of transcripts, and I had a binder full of transcripts, and I ended up, let me show this a little bit bigger. Because I know it's a lot of detail, but what I ended up doing is, you can see that every time I coded something, I ended up finding it got messier and messier and messier. And this was my way of trying to make sense out of all of these patterns that I was seeing. So I had color-coded patterns, I had words, I had process versus product, I had themes that were coming out. And you could see that things weren't so simple. Things were crossing boundaries and such. So I'm not trying to overwhelm you with this, but really trying to show you the messiness of what I was finding, which really made it very complex. So one day, as I was meeting with my dissertation advisor, she invited Dr. Patterson, that I just mentioned, to come to the table because they were good friends, and we ran in the same circle with our writing project people. And she looked at me and she said, Laura, because I didn't show you the pictures, but I kept showing things that were at opposite ends. Like we had free writing, and then we had prompt writing. Those are opposite ends. And she says, you have tensions all over your data, and you have relationships between all of these ideas. And she started to describe, you have a complex system right there that you're showing. And so I began to analyze it from some of the descriptors that we've learned of what makes a complex adaptive system. And this was my final diagram. At the end of all of that, I had lots of little diagrams, and this was my big picture. So when I ask you at the end of your journey, by the time you get through the end of the course, I want you to diagram what you have learned about with your problem. Now, here's the fallacy in what I'm asking you to do. you won't be doing any research. You might research some literature, but you're not doing a case study. You haven't reached that point. So I just want you to be able to describe visually what you have learned are the different pieces of your system or the different nested levels of your system. And I have a table that I had to be able to put in here to describe all these different pieces, but you can see that everything interacts. You've got moving pieces. You have one of the things that I said earlier, one of the big finding is that we had to have structure in this system in order for kids to be able and to have rules, not only for the writing workshop, but also for rules for good writing, etc. So I don't want to take this any further because I think that I don't want to confuse you any further. I just wanted to give you an example of where I ended up by the time I finished with my work. Your diagram does not have to look like this by any means. It can be a hand sketch. I just want you to be able to show how you have evolved in understanding your particular problem from the concept of it being a complex system. And I would venture to say a complex adaptive system because it's something that you want to be able to resolve by the end and to come to some understanding with by the end of your journey in this program. Have I just made this worse? Or
So just to be clear, the diagram, that amazingly wonderful and complex diagram, that's due at the end of the class, right?
Yes.
Okay.
That's your
Just
very last
checking.
thing. And again, it doesn't have to look like this. This took months for me to come up with. And if you were to, it's the summation of lots of moving pieces. So I don't expect this from you. I just wanted you to understand that there's lots of bits and pieces that go into it. And this is how I chose to depict my understanding of teaching expository writing, because there were interactive factors that influence the system of expository writing instruction. And this is meant to show the relationships between patterns, the conditions the teacher set, and the themes of expository writing instruction that I found. So, and I think the other thing that I was trying to do is, because I was asked to do something, they always ask us to do something visual. And then they ask you when we're doing something like a dissertation, well, what are you adding to the literature? So I thought, this is my addition to the literature. Nobody else had ever come up with it. So it was my invention. But it came after a lot of analysis and examination. So please don't, that's all I want you to take it for what it's worth. That's all. And that's it. That's all I wanted to talk about today. Next week, we will talk a lot about complex adaptive systems and try to narrow the focus from this big picture of what it means to be a part of a complex system. I will post this to the D2L in case you want to see some of the other videos, because sometimes they make more sense than all those words they put on a page that you're trying to consume when it's all new. I understand that. And let me know how I can help you along the way. Questions? Nope. I'm going to stop recording if I can get my cursor in the right place. And what I'm going to, let me see, I did put something else here. These are some of the tools that we're going to be looking at. So every time we meet, we're going to be talking about things like simple rules, pattern logic, or generative engagement model. And these will actually be little exercises that I hope we can do together to help you come to the point of understanding your problem in a different way, so that you're not just forced out there on your own. All these exercises should lead you towards that fancy diagram that you're going to create to explain your world that you live in, your own ecosystem and what it is. If this class were longer, I'd have you be reading some more of the literature related to your problem, but 1 month, 4 weeks is really short, and I know it's going to go fast. So have fun and enjoy the process. Thanks very much for being here. And I still said I would stop recording, but I haven't found the stop recording button yet. I'm working on it. And have a great rest of the week.
Thank you, Dr. Slay.
Thank you. You have a great weekend or week.
You
Just the
too.
beginning. Okay, bye-bye.